Hey everyone, welcome back to IDEANTHRO Movement and IDEANTHRO Water. We've decided to expand upon the analogy that we talked about in the last episode, and because that had some crossovers between movement and water, we've decided we're expanding upon it. This episode should be a joint episode with some crossovers as well. In the last episode, we raised an analogy, used the distinction between riparian rehab or forest rehab, bushland regeneration, and gardening to draw the distinction between our approach to movement using real movements in high variety with skill development and the approach to bodybuilding or functional fitness. And the main distinction here was that the riparian rehab and our approach to movement focuses not on building individual components, but on creating the conditions as a whole from which a healthy ecosystem or a healthy body, which is an ecosystem of its own sense, can emerge. Whereas gardening and bodybuilding focus on making individual components attractive, but never build the whole, and therefore don't ever build a resilient whole because things keep getting out of whack and requiring us to intervene all the time. One of them is much more of a create the conditions and hands off sort of situation, and the other one requires constant tinkering and intervention. Now, if you were paying close attention to that episode though, you might have had a little question, which is, okay Jack, the forest analogy, you've constantly said, with the forest, we created the initial conditions from which the forest could thrive. But why is it then that in the bodybuilding analogy, which is creating a bunch of conditions, why does that not then emerge as the whole? And this is simply going to come back to what we talked about a couple of episodes back, which is to say, it's the interactions between the elements that causes the whole to emerge. So in the forest, I would hypothesize, or I would suggest to us, that what's going on is we are creating the initial conditions. Let's just talk about the variety of plants here. But note that we've also mulched, we've also potentially removed weeds, we're also potentially going to do some watering initially to get things going. Let's just talk about the plants. The conditions that we have created here we're going to put in a bunch of different levels. So there's going to be understory species, midstory, some canopy. We're also going to put in different species within each of those levels. So in the understory, there's going to be some lamandras, there's going to be some... totally blanked on what I might put into the... some not Carix, Imparator cylindrica. We love our Imparator. And then, as well, got slightly lost there, but we're back on track now. And then we also might have species with different growth habits, which is to say we might have both pioneers and we might also have longer lived species. So species that grow quickly and species that grow longer. The point here is that when we create these conditions with the plants, they pretty quickly start interacting with each other. Let's take the pioneers versus longer lived species as an example, but we could also do this with canopy and understory, or we might even in a second. I would suggest to you that what sets the forest apart is that because we've created the right conditions, the elements of it, the individual components of the forest then start interacting. So the pioneers grow quickly and get a canopy up, which creates some shade. They also start to drop leaf litter, which then adds organic matter down into the soil. Now the shade that it's created helps to suppress weeds that typically are probably going to want a little bit more sun because they make really good use of available resources and grow really quickly. So the pioneer species help to reduce the sun, shade out the weeds a little bit, and they don't grow as quickly. So the interaction that we're starting to have here, what that's good for is the longer lived species don't then have to compete with the weeds and can just grow up at their own slower pace under the protection, under the shade of the canopy. So you can see an interaction. The interaction of the pioneer growing and creating canopy has created better conditions for the longer lived species to grow up. At the same time, the pioneer is dropping this leaf litter on the surface that breaks down and adds organic matter to the soil, and organic matter makes that soil better to grow in. So the pioneer, by its nature, is probably better at growing in degraded conditions, poor conditions, than the longer lived species that want something a little bit nicer. And so the pioneer is going, okay, I can grow in the in the degraded conditions, gets up, drops leaf litter. That makes the conditions below a little bit better, so the longer-lived plants can come up out of those conditions. And if we follow this through, ultimately the long-lived species get up, form their own canopy, the pioneers die off, and then at some point the long-lived species die, and the pioneers who dropped seeds years and years ago, their seeds germinate and they grow up and fill the gap, and the whole system repeats. The point here is that there's interaction. There is interaction between the components. In that riparian rehab, we have created the conditions from which the individual plant species can interact and thrive. The garden doesn't necessarily do that. The garden just says, look, I want that there, and doesn't think towards how it might interact and how it might help to make the conditions better. So then you as the gardener have to start to provide the interaction, which is you then mulch deliberately and consistently forever. Or you then weed forever, because you haven't necessarily put up a canopy to shade out the weeds. You could. Good gardeners will adopt these principles, because good gardeners don't necessarily like doing unnecessary work. They probably prefer to build bigger gardens. But this is where the distinction, when we come back to movement, is. The distinction here is that bodybuilding doesn't set up the interactions. The interaction, as we talked about several episodes back, is the skill, is the movement of putting those things into play. Whereas real movements, where we actually move the body as a whole, they do create the interaction, because the real movements are building and using not only the physical attributes, but the skill of how we move, however it is that we're moving. The bodybuilding just builds the physical attribute, neglects the skill, and therefore nothing emerges out of that. The bodybuilding is, drawing the analogy from a couple of episodes back, the bodybuilding is the bike and the person that's going to get on it, without that person having the ability to actually ride a bike. Okay, I hope that clarifies that apparent disconnect as to why bodybuilding, unlike the forest example, is not creating the initial conditions from which an ecosystem can thrive, as opposed to real movement that is. It's because of this thing that we've been talking about, one of these key elements of our practice. It's the skills that go with it and the using things in combination. The interaction that allows it to emerge. Okay, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, by all means, give us a like or subscribe. If you'd like to know more about what we do at IDEANTHRO, if you just got a taste of the watery stuff and want more, you can go to ideanthro.com/water. If you want to know more about our movement practice, ideanthro.com/movement. If you'd like to give our movement practice a crack, well, eventually there'll be some online training up. But if you're watching this closer to its release, you can try out our facility. You can try out our facility in Oxley, Brisbane, Australia. If you're thinking about joining up, maybe you want to join up, but want to give it a little go first, because you're like, oh, you know, this sounds good, Jack, but these concepts are a little bit out there. You can have a free trial. You can go to ideanthro.com/free-trial and do that. And if you just want to get in touch, ask a question, add to this analogy, whatever you want to do, request an episode, go to ideanthro.com/connect. Thank you for tuning in. We will see you next time.